Gorgeous and fluid, 1988's Ninja Gaiden for the NES revolutionized video game narrative by paying tribute to film classics while sporting best in-class action design. This is the Annotated Ninja Gaiden. And here we finally meet our enemy, the Jakio. This guy's only got two things on the brain: world domination via demonic resurrection and human sacrifice, and he ain't about to waste time with no ninjas. This scene makes good on the title of Act 4 in that Ryu, a guy that can shoot fire from his hands, neatly falls into an obvious trap. But that's not a problem, since this act is titled Life or Death Combat, which is the one thing our protagonist has on his mind at all times. In fact, by the time we get to the end of this level, we'll see how layered this naming really is. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. We have a catacomb to deal with after all. This is perhaps the most appropriate place to discuss Ninja Gaiden's other most defining feature after the cutscenes, its oft-discussed level of challenge. Even graphic designer and artist Masato Kato states in an interview with Hardcore Gaming 101 that Ninja Gaiden 1 and 2 were, quote, extraordinarily hard and had a general reputation as ultramaniac games. Funny enough, he recounts how the developers at Tecmo wanted to rectify this for Ninja Gaiden 3, but when it was localized for Western release, it became much more difficult than the first two, but it wasn't his fault. While certainly not impossible and perhaps even on par with many of its contemporaries, this game has garnered a certain infamy over the decades for its level of difficulty, often appearing on hardest game of all time lists by professionals and fans alike. There are a few arguments for this, and as we've already seen, just as many counterpoints. First are the enemies themselves, who are placed in levels with specific intention. The aforementioned bats that debuted in Act 2 are most often found hovering over pits, which means that Ryu has to be thoughtful about his movement as he approaches them. We see this often here in the Prison of the Dead, and this is illustrative of the methodical pacing of the game. It's mostly fast and fluid, but a player can't just barrel through it at a breakneck pace all the way to the end. Encounters with these foes are often broken into small interactions strung together, which means that a careful player can plan their way through them after enough practice, which can bring the speed of the experience back up in capable hands. Since many enemies are built to stunlock Ryu and pin him down until his health is whittled down to nothing though, one wrong move can still mean a fast loss of life. Think about the boxers in Act 1 and the green ninjas in Act 4. One mistimed sword slash and you're caught in a loop of jumping enemies that drag you toward a game over. Worse, and we've seen this ourselves already, is that enemies will respawn if Ryu moves to an inconvenient spot in the level. This is likely due to a RAM limitation of the game, and it doesn't simply load enemies into an area, but detects where Ryu is on the playing field and enacts the enemy spawn script if he lands on a specific tile bordering the screen. This was all project lead Hideo Yoshizawa was doing, who directed all of the action for the game. In several interviews, fellow staff like Kato and composer Keiji Yamagishi would praise him for his talent for making the most out of enemy placement, but even they found it difficult. Says Kato in a reunion of the three men for Polygon.com, it was too hard even for the devs. During bug checking, Kato says, team members were basically crying. Yoshizawa acknowledges this himself in a 2009 interview with Nintendo Power magazine, saying, "At the time, it was only hardcore players who played fighting games. Tecmo had a philosophy that the user would throw a game away if it wasn't hard enough." But Yoshizawa isn't a sadist. In the same Polygon piece, he mentions how the game was developed with the intent that the player should use items and sub-weapons shortly after they get them, also something that was touched upon in Act 2. Items are designed to help with certain enemies and situations, which is something we often see at points in the game where we, say, acquire the jump and slash only to find ourselves in a position where it feels as though it's absolutely necessary to go forward. After the game came out, he says they realized that certain players save and stockpile the weapons though, which, to even Yoshizawa and company, makes it a very difficult game. These enemies that we deal with throughout the game are also varied and diverse in their attack patterns and behaviors. It's not common for us to find a stationary target, and judging and counter-moving both the combat and mobility patterns of foes is the best way to reach the summit, both figuratively and literally in this level's case. Bad guys don't really randomly appear in this game, so a player can ultimately finish a level with memorization over raw skill. That is, until the game throws a curveball or two, which we see well displayed in Act 5. Take the white enemy in the first area that tosses a sickle at you which boomerangs back. This is the only enemy in the game outside of bosses that takes more than one attack to kill, 3 in this case, which is yet another use case for the windmill throwing star or jump and slash in that they make quick work of it. Second, and arguably much worse, is an element of randomness. Antagonists like the hockey mask, axe throwers, and jetpack ninjas that we see a little later toss weapons at odds staccato intervals and at angles that are rarely the same twice. If Ryu doesn't deal with them quickly, it's easy to get locked out of some difficult platforming situations with one of these guys at the end of the next jump. In a game where everything is tightly structured, even a little bit of something unreadable can throw a run of a level into chaos. Not to keep harping on it, but the jump and slash is essentially designed to mitigate this, something that we'll see clearly displayed in the next episode. I suppose you've been waiting for me to say the B word ever since this series began, and yes, here it is, the moment where we discuss the most notorious monster in this game and video games as a medium, the birds. Diving at terrible angles and dealing 3 clicks of damage with each pass, a pain output that even Yoshizawa regrets in the Polygon story, the birds are really just a symptom of the larger disease, that of the vicious platforming challenges that plague the latter half of the game and the enemies planted near them. Yet birds in this game can feel like they're the unholy alliance of both difficult enemy design with a shot of randomness as a chaser. For example, in 5-2, birds will come at the player while they're already pinned to a ladder, and this is one of the few actual gotcha moments of the game. Sure, deft attacking can overcome this, but more often than not, taking the hit is the best solution to this sort of encounter. While I can praise a developer for forcing me into that sort of in-the-moment decision-making, most people, understandably, look at this scenario, throw the controller across the room, and conclude that birds are in fact the goddamn worst. Back to those vicious platforming challenges. Since Ryu is basically scaling the side of the Temple of Darkness after being sent down a pit, it makes sense that there would be some difficult areas for his feet to find purchase. Most of these obstacles are standard fare for platforming action games of the era, but certain situations are clearly skill checks for the player though, and how the wall climb is employed in this game. The best example of this is the famous dropping wall climb in 5-2, where Ryu needs to scale the wall downward, which is counter-programming to how the rest of the game has worked up to that point. As mentioned in the first episode though, a dexterous single wall climb has unintended benefits. Essentially, if Ryu spiders up the wall with no ceiling, he'll clip through the obstacle, making this jump a trivial thing as long as he can put up with the bird on the other side. The third area is called the East Outer Wall, Nails of Lukafel, which is obviously a mistranslation of Lucifer. This is another platform-heavy location with one massive saving grace, which comes from how the game loads items between screens. Deeper into the level is the final one-up of the game, where it's situated just above the ladder that brought us into the screen where it resides. If we drop back down the ladder and scale back up, it will reset all of the item containers, making this an infinite font of light. This again is likely due to the RAM limitations of the game and how a whole level is not loaded all at once, but individual screens. The NES Castlevania games are built the same way. This all brings us to the leader of the Malice 4, Bloody Malth, who has his own pre-fight dialogue to add a little extra weight to the encounter, and we'll see why in the next episode. As a name, Malth doesn't register in very many searches, which makes me believe that his name may have originally meant to have been Bloody Mars, Mars being the Roman god of war. As he commands bolts of energy from the sky, it might amalgamate him with the god Jupiter in his command of thunderbolts. Regardless, this fight brings with it a simple courtesy in that Ryu's health is completely refilled, but this is a surprisingly easy fight, with or without the jump and slash. Malth's shield is nothing but a showpiece, and Ryu will easily finish him if he just keeps slashing away or peppering him with stars from across the screen. The pin on the right side of the screen isn't just for show though. If we're not careful, fighting Malth at a distance can mean getting pushed off of the ledge by a well-placed shot. We'll give our final regards to the Malice 4 in the next episode. See you then.